They were once as much a part of the great British seaside as fish and chips. Pleasure steamers, linking industrial cities to seaside resorts, treating ordinary people to all the trappings of a glamorous ocean voyage on day trips along the British coast.
It was a fantastic experience to be on board in your best clothes, sailing to magical places that you could only dream of from the centre of the city.
These tourists suddenly found that they had effectively a baby cruise liner on which they could go for the day, and they had all the luxury that you would expect on a much, much larger ship.
The excursion steamer was the first form of mass transport, creating a market for travelling for pleasure long before the arrival of railways. More than anything, what they did was to democratise luxury. With fares aimed at the working family, once aboard, the emphasis was on style and service.
Below deck was an atmosphere almost akin to a London hotel.
They offered the latest in entertainment.
On board that day, the star attraction was the sex symbol of the day.
At a time when drinking hours were highly regulated ashore, at sea, anything went.
Yeah, some pretty hairy sights on the way back at 10 o'clock at night, I can assure you.
High teas on the high seas. They brought the adventure of an ocean voyage whilst rarely venturing out of sight of land. Open to all, they were the people's liners. It's the early 1950s, and Britain's inshore steamer fleets are eager for business, offering coastal voyages from seaside piers that got you back in time for tea. Ashore is an era of post-war austerity. The offer afloat is a taste of luxury. The steamers operated from ports all around Britain. But the greatest concentration of steamers and piers had always been along the Clyde Riviera and on the Bristol Channel. The Bristol Channel was crisscrossed with excursion routes, operated by large paddle steamers, each carrying between 500 and 1,000 passengers. After the Second World War, they were all operated by one company.
Everybody knew P&A Campbell, the White Funnel Fleet, as it used to be called. They were a very, very big organisation. We're probably looking something about the equivalent of First Bus or the local region, one of the big regional airlines. It was the household name. If you wanted to go out for a trip, you went on Campbell's.
With the World War still a recent memory, a weary public in flight from drabness did indeed spend a day the White Funnel way, rediscovering the joys of the seaside.
Fly me to the moon and let me play among the stars.
Leaving the industry of Bristol and the South Wales coalfields, they voyaged across the Channel, the Bristol Channel, that is, to the resorts of the Devon, Somerset and Welsh coasts.
Most people didn't have a car in the 50s, so the trip to Ilfracombe on the boat, that was where the holiday started.
To a lot of South Walians, it was like obviously a different world. Some of these miners obviously could have been in the pit one day, and then next day they were in sunny Ilfracombe, maybe having a cream tea, maybe having a lobster tea even. And there was this sense of, well, they were going away, they were going abroad, they were going to England.
My childhood memories of the initial trips I made on these ships was from Newport to Weston-super-Mare. Without fail, we went to there every year for our week's holiday. We always went on the steamer as a family, mother, father, 3, 4 sometimes 5 youngsters, staying then in B&Bs. And the type of place then was you went out at 9 in the morning and you didn't come back till 6 or 7 o'clock at night, regardless of the weather. We're spending days on the beach, visiting the Grand Pier and its attractions, the donkey rides on the beach, the ice cream cones capped with chocolate sauce which set immediately, it hit the ice cream.
The steamers were far more than a mode of holiday transport. Having disembarked their first load, typically holidaymakers staying for the week, they would then welcome day trippers up the gangplank for a jaunt along the coast and back. In an age of limited holiday choices and leisure opportunities, an excursion by steamer was a thrilling ride, the holiday highlight. From the deck, you might be on passage from Cardiff to Weston. Down below, though, you could be on a transatlantic liner.
The inside was very luxurious, big staircases going down and seats around and a lot of upholstered seats in moquette and that sort of thing. Oh, yes, yes, lovely furnishings.
Some people have tried to draw a parallel between ocean liners and paddle steamers, which you might think far-fetched, but actually there are comparisons. As it were, the people's liners, the paddle steamers that the average person could travel on, were hugely luxurious.
A taste of that refinement could be found in the restaurant. Luncheons included salmon, hams and roasts, served by immaculate uniformed waiters. Neil O'Brien's father was a chief steward. Neil spent school holidays, bunked down in his cabin, and so experienced this elegance firsthand.
Tables were immaculate in the dining saloon, with the actual flowers and all the cutlery and condiments.
And the restaurant was silver service.
They were renowned even after the war, P&A Campbell, for their food.
However refined your palate, dining on a steamer came with a sense of occasion.
Fish and chips for high tea. In a saloon, my goodness. Only grown men went into saloons. And I was never allowed to eat fish and chips. So this was a great thrill.
The thrills didn't stop there. On some trips, entertainment was thrown in too. And it wasn't just any old entertainment. Like their upmarket ocean-going cousins, these people's liners showcased the stars of the day.
The entertainers were quite exceptional. I remember on one occasion, even Shirley Bassey was on board.
I've got you under my skin.
I don't know whether she would like to remember that in her star-spangled future, but she was there.
Deep in the heart of me.
Shirley Bassey wasn't the only celebrity to grace the decks.
Campbell's used to do a lot of showboats. Summer showboats, midsummer showboats. And I can remember, well, Easter 1956, they did an Easter showboat. And on board that day, the star attraction was the sex symbol of the day in the UK anyway. And her name was, it was Britain's answer to Jane Mansfield then. And her name was Sabrina.
I want a man, not a flea.
Oh, she was a sensation.
My destiny.
Sabrina came on board the Glengower for the day, caused all sorts of mayhem, havoc. People really enjoying her presence. And if I can remember, even the crew members were enjoying her presence as well.
The captain suddenly noticed that the ship had slowed down and lost speed. He looked round and found that all of his stokers from the stokehold had sneaked up on deck to get an eyeful.
That evening, I stayed on board the Glengower in Cardiff with Dad, with my father, and prior to this, I made it known to the crew. To a couple of crew members, I thought it would be great if maybe Sabrina could kiss me goodnight. You got to remember, I'm only 8 years of age now. Do you know? She actually came down into the dining saloon and she did kiss me goodnight.
I like the tan of the bronze Apollo with some muscles.
My school friends, they never believed me when I did eventually get back to school and told them that Sabrina had kissed me goodnight. But I did have some evidence, you see, which I still have today. And that was actually a photograph that Sabrina gave me, signed to Neil, Love Sabrina. I had this Easter 1956 on the White Funnel Fleet, Neil O'Brien.
To be nice, nice.
Thing that I will always remember.
I want a man.
On the cusp of major social change, British society in the early 1960s was still fairly insular. People grew up, married and settled in the same locality as their parents. Around the Bristol Channel, though, the steamers helped to broaden horizons, enabling connections across the water, relationships blossoming in their wake.
If you mingle about in Swansea and in Ilfracombe, you'll find that there is an exchange of personnel, as it were. People met and married. Some settled in Swansea, others settled in Ilfracombe.
One Sunday evening, we'd just backed out of Ilfracombe. I would just put my ropes away. I spotted this very attractive young lady sat with a much older lady drinking tea in the lounge. And I caught her eye and she caught mine. I went into the mess room and this girl was on my mind. I went back out to the lounge, sat with them, introduced myself and offered them a cup of coffee. Oh, yes, please. I subsequently sat with her for most of the way back up Channel and arranged a date for the following Thursday. We got married 3.5 years later, and we're still married now and haven't produced how many children?
The steamers not only helped to create families, there was a sense of family on board too. Robin Wall's father was a purser on the Campbell fleet.
One thing that I'll say about the Campbell's family, and I don't mean the Campbells themselves, I mean their workforce. Half of them I called uncle, although no relation. Whenever we stepped aboard the ships, we were treated like royalty.
Robin would sometimes stay aboard and lend a hand, mucking in with the crew, some of whom acted as childminders.
My dad would be wanting to go ashore for a pint, so he said, just go down and give Mr. Munden a hand, polishing the engine, you know. Yeah, all right, Dad, thank you very much. And I'd be there, a 10-year-old, working away while he had his pint.
Robin eventually joined Campbell's himself, becoming a white funnel man in 1960. As an ordinary seaman, he found himself working alongside his father. And days afloat on the Bristol Channel often meant nights ashore in South Wales.
It was wonderful. We were based mainly in Cardiff, and all the delights of Tiger Bay and the shebeens and stuff like this as a 16-year-old kid.
Cardiff's Tiger Bay was one of Britain's first multiracial neighbourhoods. By the early 1960s, there were over 50 nationalities living there.
I never saw a black face when I was a little boy. And we walked through Cardiff and you hardly see a white face. And all these guys knew my dad. Hi there, Mr. Wall, and we'd walk up and I thought this, and you could, the smell, and a Chinaman playing mahjong, you know, and I thought if this is going to sea, I'm going to have a bit of this. It was wonderful.
In the predominantly white society of the time, Robin's nights out in Tiger Bay were a foretaste of multicultural Britain.
Also, this reflected in the crew members as well on board. They came from all races and all walks of life. It had a profound effect on me.
Very much part of the communities they served around the Bristol Channel, the the white funnel ships were witness to a changing society, ahead of their times in many ways. Excursion steamers were also agents for change right around the British coast, and had been since the first steamboat arrived on the Clyde in the early 19th century. Freed from the vagaries of the wind, this first passenger-carrying steamship, the Comet, cast off in 1812.
The Comet is the equivalent of Concorde, and within a decade there are dozens of boats plying from the big cities.
The advent of the steamship was a transport revolution, predating the first steam railway by almost 20 years. Prior to this, steam engines had been housed in industrial buildings. So for many people, the early steamboats were the first time they'd experienced the wonder of steam.
The excursion steamer makes tourism. People start to get into the habit of travelling for pleasure.
Within 6 years of the Comet's maiden voyage, steamboat operators were advertising sightseeing trips and trying to attract the widest possible clientele on board.
The democratization of the steamboat and later the railway comes from the fact that they enabled all to travel, whereas previously travel in any sort of comfort had been the prerogative of the rich.
We like to think that Thomas Cook, a former Baptist preacher and active member of the Temperance Society, invented the excursion with his railway tours, but he was in fact following in the steamboat's wake.
The steamboats in Scotland invent excursions. The railways follow suit, and Thomas Cook, of course, picks up this idea in 1841. Ironically, his day trips are designed as part of the temperance movement, give people an alternative to wasting Saturday in the pub. In Scotland, it works the other way round. What we get in Scotland is the Sunday steamer being used as a way to drink. In Scotland, the steamer actually sabotages temperance. In England, the railway makes temperance with Cook. What happens is that in Scotland, there is legislation passed in the 1850s that says you can only get a drink on a Sunday if you're a genuine traveller. And within 2 weeks of this legislation, an enterprising steamboat proprietor was organising what nowadays we'd call booze cruises down the Clyde.
So popular was this Sunday pastime, it helped coin a piece of Scottish slang in which steaming means an advanced state of intoxication.
And that's why in Glasgow patois, steaming is steaming. The boats meant drink.
A favoured destination for Sabbath steaming was Rothsay on the Isle of Bute, to some the Blackpool of the Clyde.
You got on a Sunday this mob of happy holiday makers swilling off the boats, and it's no accident that the biggest urinal in Scotland is on the pier at Rothsay, and then spending a merry Sunday, perhaps drinking a little more, going to the beach, stripping off, swimming, all the things that would offend middle-class proprieties. So the steamers are really an agent of mass working-class tourism. They're called by one local MP the cheap trams of the working class.
The Victorian and Edwardian era was the high tide for Clyde steamers.
Well, probably around 30, 40, 50 paddle steamers, beginning of the 20th century, end of the 19th century, all competing for the business. All with a different colour of funnel, different colour of hull, all with different things on board, a hairdresser, a post office, some that sold no alcohol, famous Ivanhoe. So they all had their point of difference. But the steamer that could race to the pier and be first at the pier was the one that got all the passengers, and that was the one that got all the glory.
I'll sing of a river I'm happy Mary beside. The song that I sing is a song of the Clyde.
Chasing the desires of the day, steamers got faster, larger, and ever more luxurious, each with a devoted following. A 1930s flyer was the Jeannie Deans, the most commodious, the Queen Mary.
The Queen Mary and the Lucy Ashton were the ones that we travelled on. We always hoped it would be the Queen Mary because it was plush. She was big. She was fast. She still had a residue of her pre-war grandeur. People thought of her as a liner rather than a steamship on the River Clyde. She was a cut above the rest.
On her daily trip, the 10 o'clock from Glasgow to Dunoon and Rothesay, Queen Mary would pass the Clyde shipyards, where Cunard's latest luxury liner was taking shape.
The directors of the Cunard Company decided to build a new and vast liner for the transatlantic and call her Queen Victoria. And they felt they had to have royal approval, and they went to see King George V, and they said that they were going to name her Queen, at which point he's reputed to have butted in and said, "How wonderful, my wife Queen Mary will be quite delighted." So they never got to tell him that it was going to Victoria, and they were far too embarrassed to say anything. They had to accept the royal will. When they got back to headquarters, they discovered to their horror that there already was a Queen Mary plying her legitimate life on the Clyde. And so they came cap in hand, the board of Cunard, to the board of the Caledonian Steam Packet Company and begged to have the name Queen Mary. And it was graciously agreed that the one on the Clyde would become Queen Mary II. She would have a wonderful, huge painting of Queen Mary in the forelound gifted by the Cunard Company.
Dealt with as equals by the owners of the world's fastest luxury liner, the Clyde steamers were at the height of their prestige. Then, war was declared. Within days, excursion steamers all around the coast were being requisitioned by the Admiralty, and by early 1940, some 30 vessels had swapped deck chairs for armament and were engaged in one of the most hazardous naval duties of the war.
Paddle steamers made superb minesweepers because they were shallow draft, so they could often float over minefields where other ships would hit the mine. They were fast, they had broad decks, and they were ideal for minesweeping kit to be carried. Fundamentally, what was done was a wire was paid out each side of the ship over the stern, attached to a paravane, which was a torpedo-shaped float. The idea was that the wire would cut the mooring lines of the floating mines, and they would float to the surface, where they'd then be sunk by gunfire or rifle fire from the deck of the steamer.
But if that was dangerous, it was nothing compared to what they steamed into at perhaps Britain's most desperate hour.
May 26, 1940, the beaches at Dunkirk, and the beginning of an 8-day saga that prevented the complete annihilation of the Allied armies.
With the British Expeditionary Force cornered on the beaches of Dunkirk, the call went out for any ships to rescue them.
The minesweeping flotillas were very quickly called in and told to make for Dunkirk.
Amongst the crowds awaiting rescue was Army supply driver Jim Chivers.
We got dive bomb from Stugers and that. We just lucky we didn't get hit or anything. We just lay waiting there, eating some blooming biscuits and bully beef or something or another, whatever was going around, until we got the orders, you know, to go up to the boat.
That boat was the Medway Queen.
I went down below, and I just flaked out. Medway Queen, yeah. I'm definitely thankful to her, because I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for her.
And she's often been called the heroine of Dunkirk because she took more people off the beaches than any other paddle steamer, and possibly more than any other merchant ship. She made 7 crossings, no change of crew, and carried over 3,500 people off the beaches.
The day after Churchill's "We shall fight them on the beaches" speech, Yorkshire-born writer J.B. Priestley, author of An Inspector Calls, broadcast the first of his BBC Radio postscripts.
We've known them and laughed at them, these fussy little steamers, all our lives. We've called them the shilling six. We've watched them load and unload their crowds of holiday passengers, the gents full of high spirits and bottled beer, the ladies eating pork pies, the children sticky with peppermint rock. But they were called out of that world. Yes, these Brighton belles and Brighton queens left that innocent, foolish world of theirs to sail into the inferno, to defy bombs, shells, magnetic mines, torpedoes, machine gun fire, to rescue our soldiers. And our great-grandchildren, when they learn how we began this war by snatching glory out of defeat and then swept on to victory, may also learn how the little holiday steamers made an excursion to hell and came back glorious.
Of the 50-plus paddle steamers called up for service, 17 were sunk throughout hostilities. 6 of those at Dunkirk, and a further 11 had to be scrapped. So the end of the war in 1945 brought the urgent need for new steamers. With government compensation to fund new builds, most steamer companies looked to the future.
Things will turn out fine tomorrow, all along the line tomorrow.
And chose efficient diesel motor propeller ships. Emblems of post-war modernity, they embraced the technology and design of the day.
Always bear in mind tomorrow.
But on the Clyde and Bristol Channel, the 2 busiest steamer regions, operators opted for what they knew. 4 brand new paddle steamers were commissioned, 2 for Scottish Waters, the Waverley and Maid of the Loch, and 2 for P&A Campbell's White Funnel fleet. All new builds, but in terms of design and appearance, they all looked back to an earlier age.
Yesterday's a mystery, today will soon be history, but what a day it's gonna be tomorrow.
The 2 paddlers launched by White Funnel were the largest and most regal yet, Bristol Queen and Cardiff Queen. Their pre-war elegance struck a chord with post-war holidaymakers, and they became firm favourites on the Bristol Channel, each building a devoted following with passengers and crew.
Bristol Queen was very special. She was the cream of the cream. She was lovely inside. A first-class passenger ship.
The decision to stick with paddle propulsion also proved popular.
My mum described it as like a swan coming out the river over the top of the water, and all you could hear was flop, 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 flop of the paddles.
It's a beautiful sound, the sound of paddles going through the water. It's a sound of power and an overall sense of, hey, yeah, we're going somewhere.
In the late 40s and early 50s, Campbell certainly were going somewhere. They ran 6 White Funnel paddle steamers. Passenger numbers were buoyant. One steamer institution that was as popular as ever was the bar. Drinking culture at the time was still a mostly male preserve, and alcohol was mainly drunk behind closed doors or on a steamer below decks. Father's perennial desire to go down and see the engines was a euphemism across steamer fleets. Licensing laws ashore restricted drinking hours, but once at sea, the bar was always open.
Of course, there was no Sunday opening in South Wales, so of course they would flock across on the ferry boat from Cardiff, Penarth to Weston. And on Weston Pier they had a restaurant, they had a bar, and they had a bit of a fairground. Some people wouldn't go off the pier. And similarly, further down the channel, the Swansea people were going across to Ilfracombe. They could drink all the way across because as soon as the ship sailed, the bar was open. So if it was 9:30 in the morning, that was fine.
The whole of the South Wales valleys would descend on Cardiff Pierhead on a Sunday morning, and it could be thousands and thousands. And the steamers on the way back, it was just like a church choir, really. They'd be in the bars or even in the saloons, or even if they had enough, they'd be up on deck. The actual songs that they sang, as we know, the Wales is the land of song. They would be there singing, and I can hear that sound, those sounds even now.
And yeah, some pretty hairy sights on the way back at 10 o'clock at night, I can assure you. 16 years old, blonde hair, blue eyes, and women would tease you and sort of goose you and, you know, that sort of stuff. Well, you certainly saw the variety of life.
The boozy, boisterous bars were also a feature of steamers north of the border. Post-war, business was booming. From the bar up to the promenade deck, it was steaming as usual on the Clyde.
The 1950s were the heyday, the halcyon days of the steamers, and there were still 14 of them on the Clyde. They were full every day.
We could have gone to Monte Carlo.
People would go on these steamers for their main fortnight's holiday. That was their main fortnight's holiday. My parents used to take us on holiday to Island of Arn.
We could have gone to some island paradise and there have had a tear. But there was no appeal, we feel real, like going in the water from the fair.
And from Glasgow, there is this immense exodus called Doon the Water, which lasts until the late 1950s, early 1960s.
So we're going in the water, we're going in the water for the fair. We'll wend our way to Rothsay Bay, as our heart lies there.
At the height of the season, there was a daily departure Doon the Water from Glasgow, along with further sailings downriver, 10 each morning from Gourock alone.
We're going in the water for the fair.
The steamers could carry between 500 and 1,500 passengers per trip. Queen Mary II had room for over 2,000, and demand was high. The person charged with looking after all these passengers on board ship was the purser and his assistants. One young assistant was student teacher Duncan Graham, who worked across the Clyde fleet over 5 consecutive summers. It gave him a porthole onto 1950s dreams and aspirations.
To be transported to Rothsay was just as magic as for you or I to be translated to the Canaries or the south of Spain. Rothsay had palm trees, beautiful gardens, beautiful views, entertainments. You could take a rowing boat, an Ori boat as it was called out in the bay. But it was a playground with cleanliness, beauty, light and air. It was like lifting a curtain onto a different world.
The same steamer would call at a number of resorts per trip. Part of the purser's job was to sell tickets, and Duncan noticed that different groups chose different destinations.
Working class people made either for Largs or Rothsay, which was laughingly called Scotland's Madeira, by the way.
Having called at Rothsay, some steamers would continue on to Arran.
The Isle of Arran was above all the middle-class holiday resort. Chaps wore shorts and shirts and played golf and hiked in Arran. And the boarding houses were a class above that. They hid the HP sauce. It wasn't in the windows as it was in the boarding houses in Rothsay. So if you were a sort of middle-class holiday maker, you went to Arran.
Class differences, were also apparent between officers and crew.
Being a person on the Clyde steamers was a wonderful introduction to human life for a young innocent student like myself. I mean, the first day on a payday when we handed out the wages in cash, and I saw the women in the pier desperately trying to get hold of some money before their husbands dashed off to the pub, I learned about the hardness of life.
At the other end of the social scale, Duncan also witnessed the excesses of some of the Clyde captains.
Ladies came aboard, some of whom were very charming, particularly to myself, who in my innocence I did not realise were ladies of the night, of whom quite the most wonderful was a lady called the Duchess. She lived permanently, as far as I knew, in the Royal Hotel in Ellen. Drove down to the boat, down the steep hill in a car with a chauffeur, and came aboard, dressed in all her finery. She looked like a duchess. I believed she was one in my innocence. And she, I would hand her aboard, and she would go up to the captain's cabin, and she would reappear 3 hours later once we had done whatever cruise we were doing. She would come down, and you'd hardly believe it, she would give me half a crown as she left the boat. She would sweep half a crown into my hand along with her ticket, because she had a ticket, which was interesting. And off she would go in her hired car, would be waiting at the head of the pier. And of course, years later, I learned all about the Duchess and learned that the steamer I worked on wasn't the only one that she visited. She had a very select clientele.
Appearances were often deceptive in the world of the steamers. On their daily voyages down the Clyde, the pleasure boats passed an unremarkable vessel. It sailed a very similar route from city centre to the coast, but few people gave her a second glance. She carried the lowliest of human cargo.
Shield Hall's role was to take treated sewage out to sea and dump it.
Alongside her utilitarian function, Shield Hall had a surprising double life. Fares across steamer fleets were priced at a level that the majority could afford. But unique to Glasgow, the corporation offered free excursions to those who couldn't pay for the usual trips.
It was carrying on a tradition that started around about the time of the First World War for groups of people, typically pensioners, who really couldn't afford an excursion or a day out. And she'd take 60 or 70 people out for the day. They would then steam the ships down the Clyde, and around about 1.5 miles off Garrick Head, the ship would steam in a slow circle and drop the cargo. The passengers by this time would typically be in at lunch, unless they particularly wanted to see the cargo being discharged. The ship would then steam around in a big circle, complete the discharge, turn around and go back up the Clyde again.
As living standards began to rise, there wasn't the same social need for Shield Hall's free trip and lunch. So the excursion was thrown open to community groups, and a whole new set of passengers came aboard.
By the time that the late 50s, early 60s came along, there was groups such as the local wine circle, the Women's Institute, would receive an invitation to present themselves at the sewage works, again completely free of charge.
By the early 1960s, the steamers had become such institutions that they seemed a mainstay of Clyde life. But with growing affluence, holiday horizons were expanding, and the incredible enterprise that had turned a sewage vessel into a quasi-cruise ship was struggling to keep pace.
Once you could have a cheap holiday and you could sample the delights of Marbella rather than that of Rothsay, and once you took the weather into account, then it was a non-starter. And like all the seaside resorts in Britain, Rothsay and Lars began a slow decline.
Maybe people are not quite as hardy as they used to be. The days of braving it out on the decks of a Clyde steamer, when the rain's tipping down and people's aspirations moved up a notch, really.
And for the first time since the invention of the Comet, the excursion steamer once an agent of change, was now out of step with social change. Personal mobility was also moving up a gear.
In the 1950s, few families, including my own, had cars. And then there came the mass market, the Mini, I think, in 1959. By the mid-60s, people wanted boats to take them across the river so they could carry out their own likely excursions.
It was the beginning of the age of the car ferry. With the rise in car ownership nationwide, it was also the age of the motorway. And at the top end of the Bristol Channel, a modern motorway bridge linking South Wales to the southwest of England was taking shape, casting a long shadow over the steamer trade.
In the 60s, the trade declined, partially attributed to the Severn Bridge in 1966 being built.
So instead of going from 3 hours from Cardiff to Ilfracombe on a ship, being ill, being cold, being wet, you could drive there in 3 hours with the whole family, you know, for 3 gallons of petrol. You're down there for £2.
And steamers had become dated. An independent generation, no longer content to follow in their parents' holiday footsteps, were finding destinations and distractions of their own.
I'm not like everybody else. I'm not like everybody else.
It wasn't the in thing to do to go on board a paddle steamer to go down to Ilfracombe.
I'm not like everybody else.
They just fell out of fashion, I think. Perhaps that's the kindest thing to say.
Like everybody else.
Whilst the 60s swung, the steamers were shunned. As incomes fell, maintenance was cut back. Bristol Queen and Cardiff Queen, pride of the Bristol Channel, and only launched 20 years before, started to look scruffy.
You know, the ships were all clanking round and running late with paddle trouble.
Something Ross Floyd experienced on board the Bristol Queen on a trip to Lundy Island in the summer of 1966.
She was clanking and banging, and eventually the purser came on and said that due to a technical malfunction, the steamer would be returning to Ilfracombe. There was a great groan went up, and that was the end of getting to Lundy for that year.
Slowly, they disappeared.
"13 days after the Bristol Queen did a celebratory cruise to mark the opening of the Severn Bridge on the 8th of September 1966, her sister ship was laid up.
Any sailor falls in love with his first ship, and my first ship was the Cardiff Queen. And she was taken to Newport. Someone had the idea of tying her up in the River Usk and making her a nightclub, and the ship obviously didn't agree with this because she broke adrift. So they took her down the river a couple of yards to Cashmore's Yard, and I got pictures of people sat there with burning gear, burning up the Cardiff Queen. But that was her end.
Bristol Queen lasted just one more year. By this time, Ted Davis was an apprentice pilot in Barry, South Wales, and on his weeks off did relief work on the Queen.
I was on the Bristol Queen for 6 days as ordinary seaman in August '67, and the day after I left her, I had to return to my job as an apprentice on the pilot boat at Barry.
Ted arranged to meet his Bristol Queen shipmates for a night out in Cardiff the following Saturday.
Unfortunately, that Saturday never came because she backed out of Barry one morning on her way down to Ilfracombe. She sounded a mournful 3 blasts on the whistle, which bounced off the harbour walls. I saw her go out into the channel and thought nothing more of it.
Just as we got to the Merker Buoy, which is 3 miles from Barry, I heard a thud, then a crash. We must have hit something very, very heavy. It must have been submerged, sort of floating just under the surface, because I saw nothing.
I could see her out in the channel, drifting for a while. She eventually managed to get underway, and she limped back up the pontoons in Cardiff.
Bristol Queen had suffered catastrophic damage to a paddle wheel.
I was due to do a trip down to Lundy Island, and I never sailed on her again.
On the 21st of March 1968, Bristol Queen was towed away for scrap.
I saw her come down, emerge, and slowly make her way down towards Barry, and feeling so sad that the ship that I enjoyed working on, I'd enjoyed seeing over the years, and the last of Campbell's paddle steamers being towed away to her demolition.
It was like a part of me sort of went as well when the Bristol Queen actually went.
Oh, I've listened to this record twice, 3 times a year, every year since the Bristol and Cardiff Queen were taken off service. Oh, there she is, blowing the hooter. She was wonderful. That sound still sends shivers up my spine.
Hopeful that there was still life in the British seaside holiday, though, P&A Campbell finally moved into the age of the propeller ship, the second generation of diesel-powered steamers. And so they brought Balmoral, a former Isle of Wight excursion ship, to the Bristol Channel and ran her with 2 other twin-propeller motor ships. Launched in 1949, Balmoral had the looks of luxury motor yachts of the era and was built as a replacement for paddle steamers lost in the war. Now, she was replacing the much-loved Queens.
The replacement of the paddle steamers by motor ships was a difficult period. All right, I love paddlers, but Balmoral is something very special. There were purists, dangerous people, who said, I shall never go on a motor ship. But as time went on, the lure of being able to go to sea was paramount, and you saw the old faces begin to return.
I can always remember when Balmoral first came to the Bristol Channel. I was on board and I went up onto the bridge, and her first captain was Captain Jack Wyde. He more or less skippered all the pre-war and post-war paddle steamers. I said to him, I said, what do you think of her, Captain? And I can remember his words now, Neil, she's a flyer. And by God, could she move.
Flying the flag of the White Funnel Fleet, Balmoral continued the line. The traditions of over 80 years of coastal cruising being carried on the decks of one ship. By 1971, the sole survivor in the Bristol Channel.
She basically got into a set pattern. Normally on a Tuesday, Thursday, and sometimes on a Saturday, we'd do the Swansea run across to Ilfracombe and then out to Lundy Island. That was a lucrative run in those days, Ilfracombe to Lundy Island. Lundy Island in the early 70s was where everybody seemed to want to go. Nothing for us to take 700-800 passengers out to Lundy Island. And all these passengers had to be landed by launch as well. And then interspersed with that, we'd be running day trips from Swansea up the Bristol Channel to Cardiff and Weston, the odd occasional trip to Tenby as well.
Balmoral kept White Funnel steamers afloat, linking the same destinations as the Queen's. But even Balmoral, the fuel-efficient motor ship, couldn't halt the inevitable dip in trade as the British seaside holiday continued to decline.
I suppose I was aware that the writing was on the wall for Balmoral and P&A Campbell Limited, as it was, From the mid-70s, you only had to look at the crew. They were all old men. It had to end because they were all getting older and there was not the interest and there wasn't the demand or the requirement for new people to come in.
Neil O'Brien, by this time Balmoral's purser, went to see his boss, the trilby-wearing Mr. Clifton Smith Cox.
I was a youngster, you know, and I generally could see a demise in Campbell's. It was such a shame, I didn't want to see it, and I thought to myself, hey, there's no career here for me. I said, Mr. Smith Cox, I think I've got to throw the towel in here because I can't see this going on much longer. And Mr. Smith Cox was absolutely superb about this. He agreed with me entirely, and I said, look, I'm going to go to pastures new. And so, unfortunately, I left Campbell's. I joined in Cadbury's and sold chocolate for them for 25 years.
Balmoral ploughed on, but the end came in 1980. P&A Campbell's folded, and after almost a century of white funnel pleasure trips on the Bristol Channel, Balmoral, the last steamer, was sold.
She went off as a floating bar somewhere up in Dundee. I thought I'd never see her again.
Balmoral sailed for a Scotland that was also losing its steamers. The Clyde had witnessed a catastrophic drop in the excursion trade, and no one was better placed to know the commercial realities than John Whittle, general manager of ferry operators Caledonian McBrain, which now ran the Clyde steamers.
One Friday, I went to Arran on the ferry, came back on the last journey, and there was myself, 2 other passengers, and a car on board for a crew of 28. My heart sank a bit at that.
One by one, the much-loved steamers were scrapped, until there was only one paddler left on the Clyde, the post-war Waverley, and even she was struggling.
We had to face reality and bite the bullet, but it was part of our heritage. Paddle steamers had made such a dramatic impact on shipping services, and this was the last of the line.
John had only one business option. The Waverley had to go. He invited Douglas McGowan, a leading member of the Paddle Steamer Preservation Society, to meet him.
You can imagine my absolute surprise and astonishment when he said that he was going to offer the ship to us as a gift.
And so began Waverley's preservation, the last seagoing paddle steamer in the world.
Nothing gives me more pleasure today than seeing families like today enjoying themselves on the decks of the Waverley, having fun, and looking at those children watching the pistons going round, eyes almost popping out of their head. Amazing.
Waverley now calls at ports all around the UK, but for a few weeks each year, she sails her home waters. And connects once more with the communities she was built to serve. Her decks chatter with sightseers. Father really does go down to see the engines. And hen parties flock to Rothsay. Keeping alive these traditions, Waverley has now sailed longer in preservation than as a commercial Clyde steamer. Down on the Bristol Channel, the Balmoral is back, leading a drive to revive coastal cruising here too. At Sharpness Docks, a dedicated team strive to ready her for sea again.
I work on board, doing odd jobs, which range from helping to keep the woodwork in nice condition, and when she's laid up, I can also clean out the lavatories. You know, the little things have to be dealt with as well, and I'm not ashamed to do them.
3 years of volunteer endeavour, and the last in the line of the Bristol Channel white funnel ships is about to cast off once more. With a good crowd aboard, it's slow speed ahead, down the River Avon towards the Bristol Channel, following the course of the first white funnel excursion steamer over 125 years before. With her go the dreams of a former age.
Oh my goodness, this is a really magical moment. Here we are in the river, making our fresh start just like it was in the old days. Amazing.
To hear the engine room telegraphs when we set off, and to hear the ring when they put her ahead coming out of Cumberland Basin, that brought the hairs up on my neck. Absolutely brilliant.
I've personally been sailing on the ship since I was 12 years old, and I've been sailing on her ever since. So to be back afloat and underway on her again is just wonderful.
Sitting in the morning sun, I'll be sitting when the evening comes, watching the ships roll in, then I'll watch them roll away again, yeah.
A greater cross-section of society has travelled by these people's liners than on the better-known elite ocean liners. As the last operational vessels of the two generations of excursion steamer, the paddler and the propeller ship, Waverley and Balmoral, are direct links to a forgotten part of our maritime heritage. Once boisterously, now more sedately, from the early 1800s on, the pleasure steamer translated our national love affair with the sea into something easily accessible and open to all. A gloriously populist pursuit.